Friends, welcome to the Theology Lab. We are excited for today's session. Our goal tonight is to really think in our conversation, we'll hear from our guests and how they've thought about their own identity, their social location, their relationship to evangelicalism, and what to do with the traditions that have shaped us and how we respond as culture around us continues to shape things in our world too. How do we respond as Christians and people looking to be faithful to God? So I am so excited to have Kathy and Dan here with us today. Kathy has written 2 books, contributed to being a co-author of one, and written a solo book, More Than Serving Tea and Raise Your Voice. Both incredible books that really have been just exploring Kathy's own journey as an Asian American woman, a mom, a wife, a daughter, what it means to follow Jesus. You teach yoga now. She has a very fun Instagram. 10 out of 10 would encourage you to follow her for some thoughts and some spicy takes and some good questions that I think as people who are trying to follow Jesus are worth engaging with. So Kathy, I'm so glad that you are here with us today.
Thank you.
And Dan is a covenant pastor who serves and lives in Hawaii. Dan is also, you serve on staff with InterVarsity, is that correct?
Yep,
and he
correct.
authored a book, Struggling with Evangelicalism. And just as some of us, we grappled with this a little bit in our pre-read and what does this mean to have a more global experience and perspective of evangelicalism? This comes out of your own journey. And so inviting us into this nuanced engagement with evangelicalism that helps us deal with the honest reckonings about what we can appreciate, but also the wisdom that we might need to take with us in order to shed parts of it that might not be helpful moving forward, how we make those decisions.
Thank you, Megan. Well, friends, I am excited to get started tonight. I'm going to jump right into it, make the best use of our time. As Megan said, we are looking at how, whether we say it or not, whether we know it or not, we are shaped by traditions. They form us. And we had enough confidence this year to say, our church communities more broadly in Highrock, have been shaped by evangelicalism, whether we identify as evangelicals or not. So this is a conversation where we get to just kind of nail that on the head and just say, well, what does it look like? What do you do when you are wrestling with a tradition, when you're thinking about a tradition, coming to understand it and appreciate it? So let me start out with this question. We've asked pretty much all of our guests this. Kathy and Dan, can you just tell us briefly about your relationship to evangelicalism? How would you tell us that? Just say a minute or so. Kathy, would you be willing to get us started?
Sure. It's really good to be here with all of you and see your names and faces. I didn't know I was an evangelical until I had gone on staff with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. I didn't know that was a label I was supposed to have. I just thought of myself really as a Christian, and had grown up in the Korean immigrant church. And so that is how I described my faith. I was a Christian. And then when I came on staff, I'm no longer on staff with InterVarsity, that word kept popping up. And I was like, is that what I'm supposed to be? And so I would say that is my relationship to evangelicalism. I was a part of an organization that is rooted in evangelicalism. I am adjacent and have always been adjacent to evangelicalism. And then having grown up in the Korean immigrant church, I was definitely influenced by evangelicalism when the point of Sunday school teachers from the community became and turned over those responsibilities to interns from the local seminaries, so Moody Bible, Trinity. And so I was definitely shaped by evangelicalism that way.
Hey, Scott here. If you're enjoying this video, you can like and subscribe to Theology Lab's channel below, and you'll see our latest releases and what's happening at Theology Lab right now. Also, the description and comments have a link to our podcast that features folks like David Brooks, Kristen Kobus-Dumay, and others. Enjoy the video.
Thanks for that. Dan, would you want to share?
Yeah, so I would say my relationship with evangelicalism is complicatedly close from birth. Now, that's not to say I knew I was part of evangelicalism until probably college. I learned that there were different types of Christians, and then I learned that there was something called evangelicalism. Naturally, I was at Wheaton College when I learned this as an undergrad. So it was like, this is who we are. And if you're here and you kind of fit with us, then you might be an evangelical. I say, oh, well, I totally wanted to be here for that reason. And this is the type of faith that I grew up with. So around that point, I started to put together some pieces of my own childhood as I had moved around different countries as my parents were medical missionaries in Congo, Zaire, the Philippines, as well as in Nepal. So evangelicalism became, over time, one of the threads that held my otherwise nomadic and complicated story about where even home was together. So that's kind of why I say it's complicatedly close.
Yeah. Do you have quick takes on keep the word evangelicalism, ditch the word evangelicalism? Very quick takes on that. Yes or no?
I've ditched it. I've ditched it. I serve on the board of an organization that also decided a while back to let it go. It was known as Evangelicals for Social Action. And we've moved to Christians for Social Action. And having personally decided I am not trying to fight that fight. It's not my fight to fight.
Yeah. Dan, you're probably super frustrated with this question. You wrote a whole book on this, but can you, but the question comes to you anyway.
So can you repeat the question just to make sure?
Keep the title evangelicalism or no?
Got it. Yeah, I think it really depends. The only situations where I do keep it is to try to acknowledge some sort of proximity and complicity with what type of faith is shaping me and that I benefit from. I think there are many very good reasons to drop the label in situations where it contributes towards a hindered relationship, a misunderstanding, barriers to communication, of being misunderstood. So I think it makes a lot of sense for people individually to not use the term and groups to not use it, but I think it's a case-by-case thing.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate, I think the nuances here and relationships to it are something we're going to get into tonight. Anecdotally, I will say, I'm thinking about starting a movement called Better Evangelicals that I think could really, get a lot of steam okay. But okay, let's go into the why question. Why have this conversation? Okay, like I said, evangelicalism is this tradition that, if nothing else, has shaped a lot of people who are here. It has shaped me. Why talk about it? And I can put this negatively and say, like, what happens if we just ignore it and just say, like, that's either maybe it's not me, or it's me and I'm just not going to think about it. Why is it important for us to be like self-critical in some sense? I'll let either one of you wants to chime in on this first.
Oh man, go ahead, Dan.
We're both just jumping at this one, right? I would say it's important to have an awareness of how you've been shaped, as well as an awareness of where on the Christian map you live. If you do identify as a Christian, if you're a part of a faith community that would be considered Christian, that word itself is also very general, sometimes like evangelicalism, like what does that even mean? Christian, not Christian? But when it comes to identifying specific entities, I would say, and if you're identifying the entity of Christianity and then the different parts or streams of it that make it not all the same, what makes different streams or sections of Christianity unique, whether it's Catholic Protestant or Eastern Orthodox or mainline Protestant. I mean, a lot of these are white categories that we've inherited, but even so, to the extent that we're shaped by denominations or movements like InterVarsity, I think it's helpful to try to be aware of what those are. Even if you don't use the term, it's helpful to at least develop that self-awareness that you are not a default straight from heaven Christian or straight from the book of Acts Christian. You're probably from a particular history and expression. And so the more you know about that, the less likely you are to say, center yourself as, the Christian way, and then everyone else is kind of a variation of you.
I think, I mean, personally, it's a bit like understanding your own family tree. And I wonder, how many of us here have like spit into that vial and sent it off to some company to figure out like what percentage of your, ancestry is such and such. And part of that desire is to know and understand where our stories are rooted. And so no different than understanding where my racial, cultural, ethnic heritage is from. I feel like it is important for me to really understand where my faith traditions come from, because that is where those stories, how they are told, who gets to tell them, and what the story is. And so, I can think of it as a negative thing, things that we're complicit with, and how evangelicalism has not always been a great influence. But I also can see the positive in understanding what have been the good things from this tradition that I am a part of, that has impacted not only me and my life here in the United States, but my family in Korea before we immigrated to the US, and vice versa. So also understanding how my culture impacted and continues to impact the way Christianity and broadly evangelicalism is shaped today.
Yeah. I appreciate both those responses. A way of like knowing evangelicalism, if we've been shaped by it, is a better way of knowing who we are. And then Dan, I'm thinking about your comment here that if like we are thinking our way is just the Christian way, then anything else is different. It's going to appear somehow like strange, and I mean I can't learn from it. At least it's going to put up some kind of block, right? If I just think I'm just like the standard way of being Christian, everything else is going to be harder to learn from. Okay, let's take a look at social location. Both of you speak to social location in your work. Can you really briefly tell us kind of what do you mean when you say social location? I think most of our guests will be kind of familiar with this, but just kind of very briefly, maybe one of you could unpack it, or if you could unpack what it means to both of you. And then why do you think it's important for us to be aware of it, especially within evangelicalism? Someone want to just kind of say, hey, social location, this is what I think it means.
Well, it's all of the ways in which we choose to label ourselves and are labeling one another, and are labeled by others, socioeconomic, geographic, gender, sexuality, education, all of those things, those locations, those ways in which we are seeing and experiencing and have access to the world around us is also what helps shape us and how we approach, in our conversation here, even our faith and the expressions of faith that we have. And again, I think it's important. One, for me as a Korean American woman, I have always understood that my identity is complex, and it isn't just I'm human. I've always understood that I see and experience life from a specific vantage point. And so I think that is why I have addressed social location in my work and continue to do it, even on the yoga mat when I'm teaching a class, to help understand, we have access to this kind of stuff. Not everybody does.
That's really helpful. Let me open this question then to both of you here and other reasons for understanding why social awareness is important for us to know, and anything you can say to the context of evangelicalism specifically would be really helpful.
So in my book, I use a lot of geographic, spatial metaphors, I guess, for spiritual locations. Understandably, from my upbringing, I moved around a lot geographically. And so I was in different international schools, missionary kids schools. Sometimes I was part of the majority of white people or Americans. I'm biracial, but there were times where Americans were the majority of kind of the missionary communities. And then there were other times where Americans were not. And maybe it was folks from Commonwealth countries or Asian countries. So, you know, as I got to know friends from the UK and New Zealand and Australia, it was very clear that my passport said the United States on it. And so the more I became aware of what did that mean, regardless of how I felt about it, there were certain influences and realities that were existing in our relationship simply by virtue of what nationality and where we came from in terms of that political citizenship side of things. So as I kind of started to apply that to the world of religion and faith stream, it made sense that just as I needed to be aware of how I was coming across as an American, as well as what are the things that bother other people and what are the things that people appreciate about the United States. Granted, it's a very complicated place, but generally people value the American education and healthcare resources that we have. They come from all over the globe to access those. On the other hand, around the world, our military is not seen as positively as our healthcare and universities. So it's important to understand why that is and how I'm connected to that simply by virtue of where I was born. So if we're not aware of that when it comes to social or spiritual realities as well, it just makes it harder to know who we are, as well as our strengths and weaknesses, and the dynamics of building relationships become much more challenging. Just like self-awareness is important in our kids, right? We try to teach them, like, you know, it's important. You might come across a certain way, or you might not realize, but this is an impact that you have on others.
I wonder if either of you have examples where you've done work thinking about your own social location and it's helped you either understand evangelicalism better, whether positively or negatively. Yeah.
I can think of experiences I had in the last few years when I was on staff within our varsity, specifically working in higher education, and realizing that higher education as a field, not as, you know, people who just go to college, have a completely different language. And when I entered into that world, I realized this is how evangelicals sound like to the rest of the world. We have our own language, even though we assume everybody knows we're talking about the Bible or we're talking about faith. There's very specific ways in which we communicate our faith. And how that helped me even then further wrestle and understand the importance of social location was to remind me and others to approach one another with a posture of curiosity and asking questions. So that's not necessarily what I learned as a high value in evangelicalism. There's a certainty in our faith and expression of our faith, but entering into this completely new field as a Christian, I realized I needed to ask more questions than to tell people what I thought I knew about my faith impacting the university. And so that's something that I continue to wrestle with and try to live out, having left more evangelical spaces, but still very adjacent to plenty of evangelicals who don't want to give up the label, is to approach it with curiosity and questions, clarifying questions, because my experience has been, I just assume everybody knows what I'm talking about when I'm talking about, well, you know, high value of scripture. What do we mean? Or even Dan, when you were talking about missionaries and saying American missionaries, I was like, Are we talking like nationally, passport-wise American missionaries, or when my parents are talking about Americans, they're really talking about white people, right? So kind of realizing even in the conversations that we have within, do we really understand what we mean by what we say?
I have a follow-up to that, but Dan, let me go to you to this question.
Yeah, I think, gosh, when I was at Fuller Seminary, I was in a church history class where there was an assignment to kind of look at one element of our faith, and I decided to kind of look at individualism as a key part of how evangelicals understand their faith. It's very personal. We have a personal relationship with Jesus. We have personal faith. It's a personal walk. And it was easy to see how, having grown up in other places outside of the 50 states, sometimes we talk about that negatively. And I started to think deeper too about maybe what are the advantages of thinking more personally. And I ended up coming up with, the very early stages of what would later become kind of a list of strengths and weaknesses for evangelicalism, especially in the American context. It is very individualistic, but that's not just a negative thing. It does allow for some positive features as well, such as the reality that our individual personal lives are very much impacted by our beliefs and how we position ourselves. We care a lot about if something is hitting home, or if the message is connecting, or if people are being reached, or if someone really understands a sermon or something like that. If they don't, it kind of hurts our evangelical sensibilities. Oh my goodness, what do we do to not make it practical and applicable to this person? So there are advantages, I think, to having an evangelical heritage. We just have to understand that, just like any place or any location, there's going to be challenges as well as benefits and strengths.
Okay, so based on what you both have said, I'm going to actually change my question a little bit. At first, I was going to ask if you think there's anything within evangelicalism that's like structure-wise that makes it hard for us to ask questions, that like certainty is our sin in this certain sense. You can answer that if you want, but here's what I'm going to tweak it just a little. Kathy, your book is Raise Your Voice is just like very inviting of deep introspection and asking critical questions. Like that's just like you're doing it left and right. And then Dan, your book, one of the reasons that stands out to me so much is because you name in a unique way things to appreciate about evangelicalism that as someone who's been reading a lot of this literature I just haven't seen. But then you're also like very honest about its weaknesses as well. I'm just curious, like, is there anything about your, just kind of who you are, your backgrounds, things you care about that have like allowed you to ask questions, whether you're evangelical or adjacent, but anything you feel like in your faith that's made that okay to do?
To ask questions? I mean, honestly, that was not my experience in evangelicalism. And that is why even writing the book took probably 15 years, because that type of questioning and outspokenness, or whatever you want to label, is only appropriate for certain people, and it certainly was not going to be appropriate for someone like me. So I will say that has been the downside to my experience of evangelicalism. That was not something that was encouraged, but what gave me permission to do that was my community within evangelicalism, which I would say was predominantly women of color, who over and over would say, yes, that's exactly what I'm thinking. Thank you for saying it. Thank you for being the person in the meeting. Thank you for writing that blog post. And realizing that what we had internalized was our place was to be quiet and we could ask questions silently and maybe amongst ourselves, and realizing, oh, you know, this half of the church needs to hear that it is okay to ask questions, because that is what happens throughout scripture. It is a back and forth with Jesus, and for some reason it was presented to us as a one-way conversation. And so I think that for me, that is the most honest answer that I can give. It did not come from the church.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Dan?
Yeah, I would say, you know, in my social location, as a straight college-educated male, white and Chinese American, able to fit into different scenarios, although there's certainly some situations where I'm on the margins. I'd say overall, my position of privilege in those areas has been one in which I have been permitted to ask a lot of questions, and granted, they weren't always received well, but generally speaking, I was blessed and fortunate to be in spaces that were maybe less dogmatic or more open to inquiry. And over time, I kind of saw how that was kind of unusual, because I just kind of thought, oh yeah, you know, my church is pretty easygoing, and my parents have, you know, moved around denominations, and they've got friends and different traditions, and you know, a lot of them have women pastors or conversations about social justice. So that was just kind of like, okay, yeah, that's part of my faith. And then over time, I started to see how a lot of my friends, a lot of my colleagues, a lot of folks who I was really close with really had a different upbringing or just a different experience. And I started to look at just what you said, like the structural element of why is there a pattern of this shutting down people's questions? Why is there a pattern of, you know, making all these decisions for people simply on the basis of, you know, having a big church or a big platform, and whoever's at the top of that pyramid kind of decides and everyone just follow along? Like, that wasn't my experience, but I started to see, wow, that is like a really common thing. And I think it's systemic in evangelicalism because we have resisted historically a lot of things that seem too Catholic or too traditional. We also miss some of the accountability that comes with structure, and it's kind of just every church or every mega church pastor for themselves, and whoever is in charge of that world kind of decides the doctrinal questions of the day.
Yeah, there's a lot of insights there. I really appreciate. I think even like the point you've said there, the last point, evangelicalism, it's not simply this non-denominational phenomenon, but this kind of like living outside of a tradition in a certain way can allow for this kind of lockdown on thought and not openness to question. And Kathy, I just really struck by what you said about like being in a community that would make it okay. And I like that puts this question to me in this really personal way of like, do I to what extent, you know, do I have this community where I can talk honestly and openly about my doubts, my questions, and then also, and how good of a job am I doing in making that space for other people? So I feel like you've given us some like these like very tangible, real questions for us to be wrestling with. I want to go to a question, keeping with this idea of the importance of community. I'm going to put this to Dan first, and then another question for Kathy after. But Dan, you talk in your book about the importance of like a renewal, struggling with an evangelicalism to be done within a community, how important that is. Can you just share a bit about why that is the case for you?
Yeah, I think first of all, not everyone has the luxury of going it alone. Not everyone will be treated the same way when they, you know, try to do the pull up your bootstraps type of faith. However, for those of us who are sometimes given that option of just, you know, okay, do your own personal study and read all these people and read all these books and, come up with your blog, and then you can, come up with some conclusions, and maybe people will like them. And sometimes in evangelical spaces, there's this tendency to do a lot of individual discerning, where we're kind of like the gatekeepers, and we allow different voices in, and we want to know, who do you recommend to watch or hear and read? But there isn't really a communal dimension towards figuring out, how are people impacted by the way we do our faith. What is the community like that we serve in, and how do people experience that reality of the body of Christ, that space, that just where we inhabit the faith itself. And so to do that communally, similar to one of the metaphors I use is like the movement for environmental care, creation care. There has to be an awareness of like, who's being impacted by climate change, who's being impacted by toxicity in the water, who's being impacted by the oil spills or whatever, and then figure out, okay, what are we doing collectively that's contributing to this? And even if we can't go back in time and reverse completely, as if this had never happened, as if the damage had never been done, it's already been done, but how can we at least be part of some sort of cleanup of the situation, as well as prevention of future ongoing damage and harm? And that's how I see renewal, is really, not so much fixing things or putting a better face on it for the sake of our own poll numbers or approval ratings, but for the sake of people who inhabit the space in the future. People are moving in faith-wise. People are moving into evangelicalism, whether I personally stay or not. I have an interest in trying to make that space less toxic, less harmful, less likely to be a source of pain in their life if they spend some time in these kinds of spaces. So what am I and my community doing to talk about those impacts and trying to make it a better, healthier space?
Yeah, I love that imagery that you use, and it comes up in your book a lot of trying, like, here, this is where you are, and what does it mean then to leave this place better than you found it, some kind of movement towards the good. On this point about community, Kathy, let me go to you. I'm thinking about something that you mentioned right in your book, where you have you mentioned it at one point in the book. You were told that speaking up, that raising your voice will only lead to division, to problems within a community. Can you tell us like why that is not the case? Why that does not have to be the case? And
Yeah.
let me start. Let me just put that.
Yeah. So, I think we hear it a lot even now, which is, the world today is so much more divisive and divided than it's ever been. And I wonder, really, is that true? And so I wonder, one, if that is true for people who have never had different voices speaking into their lives, and different voices that you feel like are worth listening to, or you see as fully human. And I think that raising questions can feel threatening to the status quo. And if you are, if you benefit fully from the status quo, anything that questions that can feel like a threat. And when you feel threatened, you feel like someone's trying to break things up. Why break up a good thing? So I think that is where that comes from. And I think what is so dangerous and frustrating and toxic in not just evangelicalism, so let's be clear, in any kind of religious or organized faith, when those questions shake up the status quo, the person asking the question becomes the threat. And we actually see this in scripture, right? Jesus becomes the threat because Jesus brings up the questions, whether it's the Pharisees wondering, like, who is this Jesus dude? Or the powers that be in politics. What is going on with these religious fanatics of Jesus? And I think division can be scary because we often think of it as being negative. And I know that comes from a place of a child growing up in the Korean immigrant church. And there was a joke that, like, whenever there was a difference of opinion, the church would split and then there would be two churches. And where that for me was redeemed and made beautiful was a small group that I was a part of years ago in an Asian American church that grew so large that we realized that we needed to divide. We needed to grow. We needed to split that group into two so that those two separate groups could grow. And that question was not approached as one to divide in a negative way, but that we needed to approach where we were as a community with the openness that there was something more and something different. And so that's how I have learned to approach even the criticism that is directed towards me when I start to speak up about things and, rattle cages, is that my posture is not to destroy, although maybe, quite frankly, sometimes I feel like burning it all down. But it is to ask what needs maybe to change, what maybe needs to die in order for something else to grow. So if any of you garden, I can't right now outside because it's cold. Dan, you're in Hawaii, jealous. So the ground has thawed, but not a lot is growing. I always think of tomatoes. And you really need to make sure that you are not planting right at where the stems start, but you want to bury some of those little stems at the bottom and bury them in the ground. And then as your bush starts to grow, you want to start like cutting and trimming so that the energy can focus on the key fruit and not just these like spindly little branches that grow out. Now, that's the way I feel when you're asking these questions. People are like, no, don't cut anything off. You do. You have to cut things off.
I'm going to put one more spin on a question before we go to the Q&A, and that is if there is, okay, so this is my sense of a thread that's come through our conversation so far, is that there is a certain fear in evangelicalism that gets in the way of just like of honesty, or let's just say honesty, being vulnerable with others, a sense of being ostracized from community. What can help? And then we have some great questions in the Q&A here, so that's something we can come back to. But like tips on, you think, what can help, resources from our faith and from our scriptures that might point us to hope. Let me just leave that open and ask if you have any thoughts.
If you're a faith community that is honest and open, people will come and ask their questions and they will stay to hear the answers. And then the people who are already in your community will want to stay and be vulnerable and ask those hard questions. Again, I am drawn back to scripture, and the person Jesus was so fascinating and attractive and made people ask questions of themselves. Am I afraid? Do I want to be healed? How does he know these things about me? And over, Jesus receives, waits, lets people ask questions, do absurd things, and doesn't turn them away until they've gotten a taste of hope. And so when I look at churches, I often ask, are people allowed to ask questions? Are they allowed to hurt indefinitely? And if they're not, then I wonder what kind of community is really being fostered. If we're not allowed to be fully human, and if our healing and even our joy has to happen on some sort of set timeline.
Really
Yeah,
appreciate
I
that.
think
Dan?
Yeah, I think I would say, what gives me hope amidst all that's wrong, amidst all that continues to go wrong with evangelicalism and how we handle things a lot of the time, like Kathy said, with regard to unity, with regard to questions, with regard to, people that don't fit in for whatever reason, or people that don't conform enough. What gives me hope is this continual return to the centrality of Jesus and who Jesus is, because unless somebody is totally, not a good evangelical at all, like they will want to know more about Jesus, and they will want to know more about what it means to follow Jesus and what he said and taught and did. And so I think that is our lifeline.